Okay, good morning, everyone. Lovely to see you all. Thank you so much, as always, for joining. Before I start, just to remind everyone that this will be the last share till after the December break, and we'll resume in near the start of January. Secondly, we're finishing. I hope to finish today the series we've been giving on DeRabbanans and more essentially why to keep mitzvahs at all, and start a new topic in January. So I'm open to suggestions of new big questions to cover. I've got a list of the questions that I'm interested in covering, but very happy to receive any suggestions. So please be in touch with me if you have any suggestions of big questions that we should cover as part of our new series of big questions. I wanted to use today, which is really the last session before the break, to try and clarify some of the previous points that I made in the last year. I'm not sure there's been any topic that's generated as many questions, which I apologize for. I have a feeling that perhaps I wasn't as clear as I should have been or could have been around some of the points I was making. So I just really want to use some of the time available to try and clarify what became a fairly complicated and convoluted argument. So the reason we got into this discussion was trying to understand what is the obligation to listen to DeRabbanans, which in turn developed up into what is the obligation to listen to the Torah itself, to HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself, which in turn moved up to a discussion around morals, and principally two things. Do we believe do we believe in morals? Do we believe that there are absolute morals out there? And what is our relationship to them? And how do they tie in to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and his authority and his behavior? So we sort of ended up with a 3 or 4 stage argument, and I think this led to the lack of clarity. But basically, to summarize the argument was that we need to listen to DeRabbanans because they have a force of obligation. Why do they have the force of obligation? Actually, for similar reasons to why the Torah has a force of obligation. Either because they reveal moral content, or because they create moral content. What would it mean to say they reveal moral content? It would be arguing that DeRabbanans derive their authority from Chazal's understanding of what are appropriate boundaries or extra moral obligations implicit in the value system of the Torah. So in that model, they derive their authority from that which they reveal rather than that which they create. This is the model that Rabbi Shimon took on, as quoted by Rabbi Wasserman. The alternative model is that they create moral authority. How so? Because there is an obligation, a moral duty, to listen to what Chazal say. Why is there a moral obligation to listen to them? Either because the Torah has granted them authority, as per perhaps the Rambam, or because we have accepted it upon ourselves in some form of social contract, in the same way as all nations accept upon themselves social contracts and obligations. If they derive their authority from the authority granted by the Torah, then we need to move back a level and say, what is the authority granted by the Torah? And again, we have these models. Either HaKadosh Baruch Hu reveals to us moral truths or creates moral obligations. But again, how does he create moral obligations? Just because he says so, what makes this moral? And again, the model we put forward is either because of our acceptance upon ourselves through a covenant, through a bris, to listen to what he says, that has a legal status, much like international treaties obligate nations in the commandments, or because we owe him a moral duty and moral commitment out of appreciation for creation, or out of him being our host in this world, or out of his ownership of the world, or because he has the authority of a king, and that itself creates moral obligation. The difference between the moral revelation or the moral creation model is in the moral revelation model, we are arguing that mitzvahs, even chukim, have an intrinsic moral value, a goodness value to them, whether we are able easily to recognize that or not. Whereas in the moral creation model, we're saying even if they don't have, all else being equal, any other moral value, just the mere fact that they are being commanded by someone to whom we owe a debt of gratitude gives them moral force. So someone we owe a debt of gratitude who says, please will you wear a particular coat or a particular tie, in and of in itself, this may have no moral value, but because of the debt I owe the person of moral gratitude, that gives it a moral force. The favor they are asking of me, please can you go shopping for me, may in itself not be a moral force, but the favor they are asking of me achieves moral status, achieves a moral value, because they are asking for it, and I owe them a moral commitment, whether because of ownership or creation or gratitude. So the fact of commandment creates a moral force. So this was the argument we put forward. I really now want to say the same argument rather than bottom up, starting from DeRabbanan and then working through Torahs. I want to say that the same argument top down, just because, as I said, I think that I received a large number of questions around this, and perhaps the points weren't entirely clear. And the argument I put forward was severalfold. The first argument I put forward is that there is such a thing as absolute morals. Now, that was argument number one. Argument number two is there are absolute morals even without revelation. And argument number three was that Hashem is bound by them like he is bound by logic. And I mean that in a certain, very precise way. So just taking these arguments one by one, the first argument is that morals are absolute. That doesn't mean to say that we have access always to moral arguments. It simply means that there are moral wrongs and rights, some moral arguments. It's a modest argument. It doesn't mean that we always know what is morally wrong and right. And in the 20th century, we retreated from overconfident statements, correctly so, about our ability to always access moral truths. But then we retreated too far and we moved into a universe in which moral relativism is often taken for granted. And this is simply incorrect. It's simply flawed philosophical thinking. There is no evidence for moral relativism. And on the contrary, our intuition is against moral relativism. Meaning to say we can't really imagine what it would mean to say that it's perfectly reasonable to torture a small child for fun, to choose a simple and extreme example. What would it mean to say that this is morally correct? In other words, our reason, our moral intuition revolts against the concept. It doesn't appear to us to be something true and reasonable. We wouldn't know what that would mean. If someone would claim, I'm absolutely okay with the idea of torturing a small child for fun, we wouldn't know how to relate to it. We wouldn't know what to say to it. We would consider such a person to be fundamentally unreasonable, and therefore either disbelieve what they are saying or believe that somehow there's something wrong with their mechanism, their reasoning ability. In other words, in the same way as when it comes to logic, someone who claims not to believe at all in logic, no, there's no problem with A equals B and B equals C, yet A not equaling C. We wouldn't know how to make sense of that. Our reason would revolt at such an idea. We wouldn't be able to speak to the person, we wouldn't be able to argue with them because they don't accept the premises of logic, but we would either disbelieve them that this is what they think, or we would think there's something wrong with their ability to reason. It's the same for certain simple moral truths. I'm not claiming that every situation we know the moral truth. I'm simply claiming that there are situations where there is a moral truth. Now, obviously, there will be borderline situations. How do you weigh up competing moral values? Can you sacrifice one innocent child for a particular purpose? What are the facts of the moral equations? For example, when does life begin? When does life end? Can one end life in order to save the ill person in the final stage of their life from suffering? These are indeed cases of moral intuition which we can debate. And we know that there's different stances around these matters, even though halacha takes a particular stance. So that there are, of course, cases where the morality is unclear. All I'm arguing is that there are cases where there are absolute morals. Our intuition tells us that. We don't know what it would mean for someone to claim that there are no morals in certain situations. And not only does our intuition tell us that, but that all the evidence given against this concept doesn't appear to be correct. So this is the first point, that the more reasonable philosophical stance is to adopt that morals are absolute. There are at least some moral situations where there are absolute morals. What are the arguments often given against this? Well, the cultural differences between morals. People often say, well, you see across cultures, there are completely different moral systems. And this is incorrect for two reasons. The first reason it's incorrect is because there are not completely different morals across different cultures. All cultures adopt basically the same moral systems at their core, the same few moral absolutes. Around the edges, there are disagreements. Can one kill little children who are disabled as per Sparta? Should one sacrifice a smaller number of people for the greater good of the tribe as per certain tribal cultures? What defines the moments of life and moments of death? Is it appropriate to sacrifice children for the gods? These are pushing morals to extremes and dealing with situations where the morals are competing with other values. Of course, in these situations, there's disagreements. All I'm saying is that the core moral values, there aren't disagreements about. Alternatively, one of the reasons for differences in different societies around morals are different scientific facts. So, for example, of course, whether bloodletting works or not will affect whether it is moral to bloodlet or not. But this is a disagreement over the fact, which will then have implications for the moral decision, and indeed whether sacrificing is necessary to keep the sun god appeased. Again, is a matter of fact. If you believe that the sun god won't rise unless he is appeased with sacrifice as per certain pagan groups, then of course you will make a different moral equation, but this doesn't mean that one is living in a different moral universe. So this is the first point that was made. And there's a number of questions here on the chat. One is about DeRabbanan, so I'll get back to that. Secondly, how can we square it when Hashem acts in violation of his own Torah? Again, I will get back to these points. At the moment, I'm just arguing that morals are absolute, at least in some situations. The second point I'm making is that this is even without revelation. It's often claimed that the reason for listening to the Torah is because without it, we would know nothing about morals. And this doesn't appear to be correct. To the best of my knowledge, this isn't an argument put forward in classic sources, in Chazal. It's a recent argument coined as a sort of a Kirov argument, as a reason for listening to the Torah, or believing in the Torah, because otherwise we wouldn't know anything about morals. But we don't find that. We find that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has expectations of the Dor HaMabul and the Dor HaFloga and of Paro. Even before the revelation of the Torah, there were certain expectations over how human beings should behave, irrespective of revelation. So this is the second point that we made, that the Torah seems to have moral expectations of humans with or without the giving of the Torah. The third point that we made was that Hashem is even Hashem is bound by morals. And the analogy we used for this is like he is bound by logic. That means to say that it is correct, pre-creation, we can't say anything. Pre-creation, a world pre-creation, it's not that we can say, wasn't he bound by morals, or wasn't he bound by logic pre-creation, because pre-creation we have no words. There's no concepts that we can grasp pre-creation, because we're in the world of the infinite, and words and concepts only start once one is exists in the finite world once we can use vocabulary. So we're not talking about pre-creation. However, post-creation, once we are in the world of creation and the world of words, inherent in our ability to reason is the concept of logic and morality. And once we are in the world of post-creation, we can't think what it would mean to exist outside logic, and similarly what it means to exist outside creation, outside morality. So in the same way as if we would ask, and this is pointed out by Luzzatto, if we would ask, can Hashem create a square circle? Luzzatto answers this concept as incoherent. There is no such thing as a square circle. The word square makes sense, the word circle makes sense, but the two together carry no meaning, because part of the translation, the word square, is not circle. So effectively asking, can he create a not circle circle that is a meaningless set of syllables? In the same way as this is the case with logic, this is the case with morals. Something which is fundamentally immoral is simply not reasonable to us, and therefore can a moral being do that which is immoral? Is a contradiction in terms against reason for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in the same way as a lack of logical coherence is. Now, this isn't contradiction to HaKadosh Baruch Hu being able to do everything. As Luzzatto points out, he is able to do everything. It doesn't mean he is able to do nothing. You're able to do something which isn't everything. If I ask, can Hashem do chuli? And you ask me, what does the word chuli mean? And I say, no idea. But you told me you can do anything. Can you do that? The response would be, there is no that there. It's just a syllable, chuli, which doesn't contain any meaning. Similarly, a square circle is just a sequence of syllables that doesn't contain any meaning, and therefore this is no contradiction to him being all-powerful. And exactly the same goes with moral reason. Hashofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat is a reasonable claim. So this was the third point that was made. The fourth point that was made was around the Euthyphro dilemma. Euthyphro is a conversation, the name of a person who the philosophers who Plato engaged in conversation with, who asked the paradox, which is, do the gods create morals, or are they bound by morals? If they are bound by morals, they are not free, and if they create morals, then morals are arbitrary rather than absolute. And as for pagans, this is indeed a problem, one that the Greeks were not able to resolve. For us as monotheists, this isn't a problem, because of course we ultimately believe HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the creator of everything. He's the creator of all, and therefore above human vocabulary and words and human reason. All we are arguing is that pre-creation, we can't discuss anything. Pre-creation, we don't have words and reason. But post-creation, now that we are given the ability to reason, inherent in these concepts is, yes, that we are bound by moral reason in much the same way as we are bound by logic. Now, I want here to clarify that I don't mean to say that morality is logical. I simply mean to say that morality is reasonable. It's a different type of logic, a different type of reason. I'm not arguing that there's an equivalent of an equation of A equals B and B equals C, therefore A equals C for morality, that somehow one can come up with a logical argument to be moral. I'm simply saying it has its own vocabulary of reasonableness. The truth is, even with logic, it's one of these self-sustaining ideas. We can't prove logic in terms of anything other than logic itself. If someone says, I'm not going to accept the vocabulary of logic at all, I can't prove it. I can just say that we don't know what it would mean to reason without the tools of logic. Similarly, I'm arguing we don't know what it would mean to reason without the tools of morality. We don't expect to justify logic in terms of other forms of reason like morality. It's not good to be logical or bad to be logical. It's not immoral to be illogical. It's simply illogical to be illogical. And similarly, it's not illogical to be immoral. It's immoral to be immoral. It's a form of unreason in and of itself. Our reason dictates that we should be moral, and we revolt against the idea that immorality, and again, an extreme example, just torturing a small child for fun, could possibly be something reasonable. So this is a sequence in which I've argued that morals are absolute, at least some, not that we always have access to it, that this would be even without revelation, that Hashem is bound to them post-creation, but of course we are aware he brought them into existence like he brought all into existence. Given that introduction, we can argue that there are moral reasons why we should listen to the Torah, and as we argued, one can extend these moral reasons to even apply, or at least to tweak DeRabbanan's rabbinical law also. So this was a summary of the arguments we put forward, which comes out that the reason, if someone says, why should I be good, why should I be moral? The answer is not because the Torah says you should be moral. It's the other way around. I should listen to the Torah because I should be moral. It's not that I should be moral because the Torah says I should be moral. It's I should listen to the Torah because I should be moral. And indeed, this is explicit in the Torah, in which the Torah says again and again, do and keep the Torah because it is tov, because it is good, rather than the other way around. Now, in what way is keeping the Torah moral? In what way is keeping the Torah true? So again, for this we had the different models that we put forward, either because we have committed to it and it is moral to keep that which one commits, or because God is the creator of the world and we owe him a debt of moral gratitude, a moral appreciation. He is our host, he has given us the gift of life, or because he is the all-knower, all-knowing, and therefore able to reveal to us the correct moral outcome, excuse me, in a particular situation. So there is moral force and reason we should listen to the Torah, and the Torah argues this. It says again and again, keep me, do what I am, do what I'm saying, because I am Chaim, I am life, and I am Tov, I am good. So there's a moral force to keeping the Torah. This is a summary of the sort of points that I made last week, and I hope I've structured them a little differently to try and make them a little clearer. Now, on the group, several questions have been posed, and I was also asked many questions in the week. So I do want to pause here, and if there are questions, please feel free to ask them via the chat or live. But in the meantime, I'll just try and address the questions that are posted on the side. The first question asked is, isn't the most important reason to listen to Rabbanan because the Torah tells us to listen to them, and we shouldn't stray from what they say, either left or right? And then the question finishes, apologies if this was already explained. So in a sense, this was already explained, but I want to use this as a chance just to do Chazara. The Rambam indeed argues that very point. The Rambam says the reason we should listen to DeRabbanan is because all DeRabbanan has the force of Torah law in essence, because the Torah itself tells us, keep what DeRabbanan say, because al pi Torah she'yerucha, no yosim kol she'yerucha, don't veer off that which they say. That is exactly correct. This is the view of the Rambam. The Ramban, Nachmanides, however, argues, and he says, no, this refers to the rabbinic ability to interpret, not the rabbinic ability to create. And he asks a number of questions on the Rambam. He says if all DeRabbanans have the force of Torah law and Torah authority, then there's no difference ultimately between rabbinic and Torah law. Why is it that rabbinic law has leniencies, such as in the case of doubt, a suffix, such as when there's a clash between the two values, and so on and so forth? So yes, the Rambam definitely says the primary answer is because the Torah says to keep it. The Ramban argues on this. We answered the Ramban's questions. Listen to the earlier recordings, they're all available on YouTube. The earlier recordings around these questions, but we were now discussing if the Rambam is right, that the reason we should listen to the Rabbanans is not because of Torah commandment, and we have the opposite question. So what is the reason we should listen to the Rabbanans? So the Ramban is convincing. The Ramban says, look, there must be a qualitative difference between Torah law and rabbinic law. The Ramban has his answers, but this is the view of the Ramban. If there is a qualitative difference, then we end up with the other form of the dilemma, the other problem. So what is the reason we should listen to them? And the answer to this question argues Rebbe Chanan in a very beautiful, actually 2 essays that he uses to discuss these, are one of 2 possibilities. Either the Rabbanan were able to reveal moral truths also, and therefore we accept their authority as moral guides, or they created things with moral force because we have a moral obligation to listen to them because of the authority granted to them by effectively a social covenant or social contract of sorts, by the acceptance of Klal Yisrael of their authority. So this is point number 1. The second point I was asked is around this issue of covenant and bris as a force for listening, whether this is the covenant we made with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, or the covenant we made to keep rabbinic obligations. And the question is, why am I bound by this covenant 3,500 years on from the giving of the Torah? And the answer is because of the Torah's concept of a corporate identity to Klal Yisrael. So anyone born into that corporate identity is a member of Klal Yisrael, a member of the Jewish people who as a unit accepted this covenantal authority. And this is akin to the idea of any corporate identity making a commitment which bounds those who are part of it, even if no individual was alive at the time. And this is akin to a national debt or a national treaty, which may have been made 100 years ago. There may be no Englishman alive today or British citizen alive today who accepted the authority of that, who was alive when that treaty was made. And nonetheless, by dint of part of a national identity, this remains an obligation. Same with corporate identity, in which a company may have a debt, and therefore any employee of the company remains, or the company as a whole remains obligated by this. The difference is in corporate identity, one can opt in and out. In citizenship, to a degree one can, whereas as membership of Klal Yisrael, one can't. So one is born into that national identity, that group identity of being a member of Klal Yisrael, or one can join it through the process of Geirus. And in this model, the process of Geirus isn't just acceptance of mitzvahs. It's joining a people, Klal Yisrael, and therefore through that acceptance of the mitzvahs. And this is indeed how the Rambam spells out the concept of Geirus. It's becoming part of Klal Yisrael and therefore bound by the covenantal commitment, which is Torah and mitzvahs, rather than, in a sense, the opposite way around. So just to clarify this point, why are we obligating mitzvahs? There's many answers. Of course, as humans, we should avoid hubris. Of course, we should realize that we don't always have access to the truth or the full truth. We don't always know the situation. The Torah can reveal to us moral truth. That's explanation number 1, or aspect number 1. None of these contradict each other. The second aspect is because of God having an ability to, in a sense, create moral force to something which otherwise would be morally neutral, because we owe him the debt of gratitude for creation, because he is our creator, because he is our host, because he owns the world, whichever flavor or form one wants to say that moral obligation in. And the third reason is because we committed to it. None of these are contradictory. They may all be true, but there are 3 ways of thinking about the moral force or the obligation to keep the Torah. So this is in terms of what we're keeping the Torah. I was then asked off group, and now, and indeed some emails during the week, how do we square this with when Hashem acts in violation of his own moral codes? And this can be examples such as the Akedah. This can be examples such as Jewish history. In the form the question was posed, it was Osov Espino, one isn't allowed to slaughter an animal, parent and child, on the same day, and yet he has allowed us to be slaughtered, men, women, and children, on one day in our times, in our tragic history. So again, I emphasize, of course, I'm not arguing that in every situation we can know moral truth. I'm not arguing in every situation we can judge and know every factor. In fact, in the prime example used of the human ability to question Hashem morally, part of the answer is you don't know everything. So Avram, both halves of the story are important. Avram being able to turn to Hashem and say Hashofet kol haaretz v'ya'aseh mishpat is important. The human ability to hold Hashem to account, and equally the human necessity to surrender sometimes and say we don't know all the facts. And indeed Hashem's answer to Abraham is you don't know all the facts. You don't understand what's going on in Sodom. There's pieces of information you're missing, and therefore you don't know all the facts. And this is the concept of Tzaddik V'Ralo. Now, I'm not attempting this year to give a proof, in a sense, of the truth of monotheism or of Torah. One could respond to me and say, well, this is all very convenient. It's nicely saying we can hold Hashem's moral account, but then we're always inevitably going to surrender and say we don't know everything. That's correct. In this share, I'm assuming betochen, I'm assuming emunah, I'm assuming we bow to the idea that Hashem knows more than us. And I'm simply saying, in terms of the philosophy of Judaism, we hold both halves can be said. That in principle, we expect Hashem to behave in line with mishpat, in line with justice, in line with morality, because post-creation, we have been given the authority, the right, the gift of reason, and we can't think outside reason. And on the other hand, equally to have a modesty and understand we don't know and don't understand everything about the situation. So this is morality. I read recently an article, by the way. There's a famous Holocaust story in which HaKadosh Baruch Hu was put on trial by victims of the Holocaust, of concentration camp victims. I always assumed that this was a legend, and I believe academics and historians assumed that this was a legend. It's always dangerous saying stories like that are a legend, because the truth is, how can one know that it didn't happen either? But I didn't think there was any particularly specific source that it did happen until I read an article, an interview, but with Elie Wiesel, in which he testified having been a part of the setting where this story took place. And indeed, he said that there was a group of victims of the Holocaust who put HaKadosh Baruch Hu on trial, came out against him in the case, and he said, we then went off and davened Mariv. And one has to be very, very careful when everyone says anything about the Holocaust and people who went through it. It's completely and utterly not for someone like myself to comment on the multiple responses that victims of the Shoah and people that went through it responded. Obviously, some people came through with emunah, others didn't come through with emunah. Everyone had their own response to this. So one can't comment on stories other than to say this is a story that Elie Wiesel testified to having seen. And it's a fascinating story because it in a sense summarizes what Avraham went through and what many others have experienced in these matters, in which we both have an obligation and a right to make moral decisions, and equally need to recognize the ability, the limits of our ability to make moral equations. By the way, what is well testified to, we've quoted here Rabbi Chanan Wasserman's essay around these points, and some of what I've built here is built upon his thoughts. We have a lot of testimonies around the speech he gave to the members of his yeshiva before they were deported. I mentioned already that Rabbi Chanan Wasserman was in America when the war broke out, fundraising. He came back because he believed his responsibility as Rosh Yeshiva, as father to his students in the yeshiva, was to be with them. And indeed, he ended up martyred, killed in the Holocaust along with many of his yeshiva, not all of them. And he gave a shmooze, a talk in the yeshiva around this very point. And this is the very point he made, in which he spoke about our ability of humans to reason and also the limits of our human ability to reason. And he gave what became a very famous moshel of someone who sees a farmer taking a field, a beautiful field, and running knives, blades of a plow through the field. And the person screams and says, "You're ruining this field." But the farmer gives no response. He then sees the farmer taking grain, edible, good grain, and scattering it in the field. And he says, "You're ruining this grain." And again, the farmer gives no response. "Why are you wasting this grain, throwing it into the mud and the earth?" Then he sees a few months later the grain sprouting, and now you have a beautiful field full of green plants. And he says, "Oh, now I understand why you did this. You've created this beautiful garden." And then once the farmer comes, and he cuts down this beautiful garden. And again, the man screams, "Why are you destroying this beautiful garden of growth?" And he sees the farmer taking the grain and smashing these plants. And again, he says, "Why are you smashing the plants?" Until he sees that the grain, new grain, is created out of these weeds. And he says, "Oh, now I understand. You have a beautiful pile of grain." But then he sees the farmer taking grain and grinding them and crushing them. He says, "What are you doing? You're ruining the grain." Until he realizes that out of this grain is made flour, which in turn is baked into beautiful bread. And now we understand this. And the Mashal is bringing out that when you only have a limited perspective and understanding of how the world works, our ability to reason, we have to have a modesty over our ability to reason. So again, I want to be careful over here not to imply that we always are able to make moral equations. I'm absolutely not saying. There's two reasons why we should have a modesty over our ability to reason morally. The first is a religious reason. We don't know everything. We bow to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the second is a moral reason. We've seen in the 20th century and for millennia before that, what happens when humans take moral hubris and arrogance and overplay their ability to moral reason, and how again that can lead to a fundamentalism which is as destructive as immorality. But we shouldn't go the opposite extreme either and end up with a 21st century version of moral relativism, which is equally destructive to the human spirit. We've gone too far the opposite way. And if we believe we live in moral relativism, then we have nothing meaningful to say about life. It's a surrender of the human ability to reason. And that's also incorrect. It's as bad as its twin, which doesn't believe in absolute truth, which also destroys the ability of humans to reason at all. Just because we need to be modest about ability to reason doesn't mean we should have no belief in our ability to reason. So these were the points I was trying to make, and it's based upon the Torah's expectation of us to have moral ability, that moral duty and obligation starts. As I said, the HaKadosh Baruch Hu has moral expectation of us, whether we know halacha or not, whether we have a Torah or not. Paro, the Dor HaMidbar, the Dor HaMabul, the generation of the flood, were expected to behave morally, irrespective of whether they had received the Torah or not. A human being is granted the gift of reason, and we shouldn't squander it, we shouldn't waste it. In the language of the Rambam, reason, our minds, is the most beautiful aspect of what it means to be human, and it is the only interface ultimately that we have with God, the only ability that we have to understand and achieve is through use of reason. By reason, I don't just mean cold logic, mathematical logic, I also mean moral reason. But this is the thought expressed by Rabbi Chanan and by the Rambam, and I hope there's a little greater clarity to some of the ideas we were discussing. Any further questions or thoughts around this? Because as I said, this will be the last share on this topic, but I felt it made sense just to go back to this since it created a lot of questions around these ideas before we move on to our next subject. Okay, so we will stop there for today because I think this concludes what I wanted to say. Just to remind you, as I said, there won't be a share for a couple more weeks, and then we will restart sometime near the beginning of January. Please, I have a list of topics that other people have proposed, but I would like to continue the series of big questions, and if there are any issues you want me to address as part of the series of big questions, I'm happy to do so in the context of this series.
Morning, Rabbi. Good morning to you.